That's my first provocation. My second provocation is about a crisis in our professional community. So we have a crisis in our education, we have another crisis in our professional community, especially for the transitional period in Sudan, where our community is a highly divided professional community. So, and I say this constructively, I don't say it critically, I say it with a hope for healing, but there's a lot of divisions. There's a division between SAF, Sudan Architecture Forum, Al-Jam'iyya Al-Mi'mariyya. I also detect divisions, or perhaps a form of isolation, I'm not sure, من جامعة الخرطوم, معمار جامعة الخرطوم, and all the other architecture groupings and universities and so on. And I really believe that's a crisis for our profession, and I'm hoping that we will jointly try to address that issue. So, to come to my main talk, why resilience? Resilience because of climate change, because of political unrest, because of financial instability, poverty and displacement. Why the next generation? Our generation in the diaspora, my generation, الجيل بتاعي أنا, I've heard or read at least one person describe us as a جيل الأناني. We left Sudan in large numbers. A few of us remained, but the majority of the educated people of my generation left. That's a very خلقت gap and something that also needs to be healed. Why in my title do I use architects and not designers? Because there's, I think, differences in opinions about what architecture is. There's differences in opinion. I personally believe that architecture is inseparable from urban design. So to avoid those differences in opinion about what architecture is, I've used the term designers here. So, having said thank you so much. Let me get to resilience thinking for the next generation of designers, starting with a little bit about my journey. So I graduated in '88 in Khartoum. Went to the Netherlands for 6 months, which was a highly influential time in my career. I went to the Netherlands to study housing, and then I came back to Khartoum for a while. I finished my master's under Professor Agra, Allah yarhamu, and then I went to South Africa, or to Lesotho actually, as a United Nations volunteer. That's how someone was asking me how I ended up going south when everyone was going north or other places. So I ended up going to Lesotho, and then I ended up working in South Africa. Before I left for South Africa, I worked for quite some time in my father's practice. I'm a Sadiq architectural consultant. I blog and I write. يعني بتلقوا جزء من الميموريز بتاعتي دي والاكسبيرينسز دي on my website amiraosman.co.za. And then the most influential period, as I mentioned, was 1992 in Rotterdam at the Institute for Housing Studies, and I'm going to explain why it influenced me so much. This is one page out of my dissertation at the IHS in Rotterdam, where I looked at a house unit. Do you think it's better if I sit? I looked at I looked at the development of a core unit, a core residential unit, and all the different routes of growth. Ending up in this particular diagram with 218 possibilities for the development from a core unit to a full house. And this was referred to by my supervisor at the time as a generative graph. This was the final house, very simple design. There's nothing outstanding or like particularly fancy about the design, but the generative graph was what was important in this process. The advantage of the generative graph is that it is a process-oriented design approach and not a product-oriented approach. It avoids providing a single line of development since this is rarely followed. There is still some control of development. The architect, instead of providing one plan of development, will be providing 200 to 300 or more plans. But this is definitely positive control, since it is extremely flexible, especially with the introduction of the support system. The core unit or seed of the design will unobtrusively influence all of the coming stages. I'm not sure if you can make the link between what I said about being really good and getting good marks at the University of Khartoum by producing nice objects on a site and then coming to produce this kind of thinking about architecture. Complete shift in thinking that happened to me when I was 24 years old in Rotterdam in 1992, when I started to think more of design as a process than a product. And then I discovered there's a whole world out there that thinks about architecture differently, but unfortunately it's not mainstream. Institutional architecture is still very much focused on buildings and objects rather than processes and space. So I discovered John Habraken in this process. I discovered someone called Frans van der Werf. So my links with the Netherlands continued for many years. And I started thinking about this shift in thinking from the fact that I started thinking about architecture as being inseparable from urban design was this idea of levels that you can see in this diagram, from city to urban tissue to support to infill. And I discovered again someone called Kendall in the United States who went on to become a friend and a mentor. He thinks of the environment also in terms of levels, and you can see here that we think of these levels depending on how long, are you designing for something to last for 300 years or are you designing something to last 2 to 10 years. وهسه في النقاشات اللي بتحصل في الترانزيشنال بيريود في السودان عن انه يعني how our built environment needs to transform. أنا أمنيتي إنه في الديبيتس اللي بتحصل والstrategies that we develop about البنية التحتية في السودان إنه نبدأ نفكر in terms of levels, long-term and short-term elements. Who decides what use? You can see there's like large groups of people looking at the district level and smaller groups and individuals looking at the residential units, the blocks, and we need this kind of level thinking in the built environment. So my thinking transitioned from thinking of objects in space to thinking about integrated environments. And then I started developing my own theories around that and applications where I believed that we need to, I still believe that we need to develop a system where the government is a facilitator. We need to distribute decision making in the built environment. We need to separate levels of the built environment so that different people make decisions at different levels without disrupting the overall functioning and coherence of a neighborhood, a city block, or a precinct. And this influenced my practice also when I practiced in a limited way in South Africa, but I was involved in some designs and some projects over the years. Some of them built like this one. These are my very initial sketches, but this different way of thinking about architecture greatly influenced every decision I made in practice and in my teaching. This is another project that's built, all of these in collaboration with other architects, but these are my own sketches for these projects, but again thinking very much in terms of systems and processes as opposed to just thinking in terms of objects. So over the years I became very interested in this way of thinking, which is referred to as open building. I have a blog where I say is open building architecture, so please do refer to the blog. But it's a way of thinking, it's a very different way of thinking about the built environment, and it's not mainstream, and it actually is in a opposition in a way to institutional architectural thinking and practice. I started to think about alternative housing strategies, so I became very interested and still am in housing processes and products in South Africa, and I started to think about how this influences my own practice as a teacher or as someone that instructs students in architecture. I started to think of training architects outside of the architectural studio, outside of the campus environment. We started workshopping things, we started working directly with communities, learning by doing and sharing of technical know-how with communities, and using local knowledge to inform our design processes, and using the city as a laboratory for our teaching. So over the years, this is the kind of work I did with my students at the University of Pretoria. I didn't establish the master's program at the University of Pretoria. Sorry, Tasneem. Just another disclaimer, but I participated and I ran the honors for many years, and this is where we did these kinds of experiments. We worked in communities, we built small projects, and I started teaching through doing as much as I could. And I did this for many years. These are some of my students with a local artist. We collaborated with local artists in our projects, and we tried to source skills and materials from as close as possible to the site. So the students actually had to develop these diagrams where they showed where they were getting their, who they were employing and where they were getting their material. And the challenge was not to go too far away from the sites where we were working. And at the bottom you can see some photos of the artists in the local community that we collaborated with. I went on to do the same kind of work at the University of Johannesburg, where I worked for 5 years. I worked at the University of Pretoria for about 11.5 years. I went in between, I did 2.5 years at a research institute, and then I did 5 years at the University of Johannesburg, where I established something called UJ Unit 2. There's also a website that you can refer to. This is me with some of my students on top of a building in central Johannesburg. So I carried a lot of this thinking and this different way of teaching to Johannesburg as well. And then coming to this idea in my teaching, this idea of resilience, and especially now with Sudan going through a transitional period, thinking about how we might be able to respond to change and respond to transitions. And maybe if there's a crisis, it's an opportunity to do things differently. And I was hugely inspired by my visit to Kigali and how change was happening there after an extremely difficult crisis in that country. And now, one of my arguments is always that you cannot achieve resilience in societies with high inequality. I'm very influenced by two South Africans, Buchard and Dua, who wrote many years ago a manifesto for change for South African cities, that successful urban environments are environments that work for the rich and the poor. This is so core to my thinking. Successful environments work both for the rich and the poor. Greater economic equality, not greater wealth, successful societies. I'm going to skip that last one and go to this one. It's not just the poor, but whole societies from top to bottom that are adversely affected by inequality. So if I live in an unequal society, and South Africa is a highly unequal society, even though I might not be one of the poor, but I'm still disadvantaged by the inequality, and I think that's incredibly important to acknowledge. These two images, one of them I got from the internet, it's Sit Shai in Khartoum, and the other one is a photo I took myself of the local transport system in Kigali, and in the background you can see the shimmering towers of central Kigali. Okay, and there's a reason for me to show these this juxtaposition of local ways of doing, kind of grassroots ways of doing, and a big money, big capital as represented in the city in the background. I hope some of you, or maybe all of you, have seen the movie Black Panther.
Yeah.
Do all of you?
خليه شغال. حسن الضفي.
أحسن منه نواصل بعد الفاصل.